Thank you everybody who has joined us for this talk on mastering the art of communication. And we have a lot of important things to talk about today, so I want to jump right in. So first I want to start with a land acknowledgement, and we want to acknowledge the land that which UHN operates on. There has been a UHN hospital on this land since 1829. Long before that, Indigenous people were its stewards. They, as their descendants, and we at UHN do now, learned, shared knowledge, and healed each other. Ontario is covered by 46 territorial treaties and agreements with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Regardless of where we sit today, we owe much to the peoples that have called this land home. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work here. We remember and honor the legacy of the peoples who have been there before us, and all who work to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real. I'd like to take a moment to invite you to join me in reflecting on the land that you are currently on. Thank you. So a couple of tips as we get started. First, we want you to please remain muted and keep your video off. And I see somebody has mastered drawing on the screen, which is very impressive, but please try to avoid that during the talk. We will be recording the presentation and the slides will be made available to everyone. So feel free to relax and just listen because you'll have all of the material later for you to review over time. And lastly, this is a safe space, so we require all participants to follow the ORT Code of Conduct, and any non-compliance will result from a removal of the event. And you can review the Code of Conduct on the Eventbrite page for the event today. Lastly, we encourage you to ask questions, and so if you have any questions at any point in time during the presentation, please feel free to add them to the Slido that we have, and Claire will be adding that to the chat periodically. This is just a great way for us to keep track of the questions so that we can answer them for you. With that being said, I'd love to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Veri, and I'm the lead of the research training programs in the Office of Research Trainees at UHN. And it is my job to support trainees and create training sessions and webinars to help you to build your research and professional development skills. And it is my pleasure to join you all today to help you to master the art of communication. I'm going to share some tips with you of how to become a great oral research presenter. So first, I want to start by telling you my communication journey. And so when I first started graduate school, I was intensely afraid of public speaking. I had little to no experience in it whatsoever, and it scared me at all costs. So when it came to the first time that I had to give a research presentation, it was the beginning of grad school, and I had to give my first committee meeting presentation. And 100%, it was an absolute disaster. I thought I was going to faint. I thought I was going to throw up. I read all of my notes off of my piece of paper straight. I forgot all of the details I was supposed to mention, and 100%, nobody in the audience got a single thing from the presentation. It was horrendous. And so I really was a bad communicator to start. Flash forward a couple of years later, I defended my PhD, and by this time I became a very confident speaker, and I actually started to enjoy it so much. And here's a picture of me at my defense. I hope you can see how happy I am, and I really was enjoying every minute of presenting my research. Even better than that, over this time, I gained so many communication skills that I started to be invited to speak at events. And one of my favorite ones was this picture here. I was invited to speak at events alongside Dr. Imogen Coe and Dr. David Naylor, who are two amazing and inspiring scientists in the Toronto area. And as I was giving this speech or this talk, I was just so excited and so thrilled to be there. And then afterwards, somebody from the audience came up to me to compliment me on my speaking and invited me to speak at one of their events later in the month. And since then, I've given talks for RCI Science, which is that organization, for years. And it really shows that this transition, how I went from a person who was completely scared and couldn't speak at all to somebody who was so confident and was recognized for their speaking abilities. So the real question is, how did I get there? How did I make this transition? And how can you do the same transition and become a confident speaker? Now, if you don't remember absolutely anything from my presentation except for this, I will be happy. So number one thing I want you to remember today is that anyone can be a great communicator if you are willing to put the work in. So wasn't naturally a fantastic speaker, although some people are born that way, and that's amazing. But I was able to make huge amounts of improvement by practicing at all costs. And so what I was able to do was take every opportunity to present my research and sign myself up for every talk, every seminar possible. And I practiced with everyone I knew, to the point where I was practicing so much that I could give my presentations in the shower or while I was walking down the street. And I know that seems super, super excessive, but I really needed to be able to be confident in my speaking skills so that even if I got super, super nervous in that moment and felt like I was going to black out, I would still remember my research and still remember my presentation. And over time, that intense practicing really allowed me to become better at it. Another thing I did was really try to seek and accept constructive feedback. So I was very fortunate that I was in a lab that did practice talks for every single talk that we had to give to an external audience. And so this meant I was given twice the amount of opportunities to present, but also meant I got really good feedback on how to constantly improve my slides and my presentation skills. Now, even if your lab doesn't have a mechanism like this, you can always ask your lab mates to be able to practice with them so you can get this feedback, or use any other group of people. And of course, it's important to remember to give yourself the time to improve, because improvements can be very incremental. Just think about it like your research and like an experiment. You want to start with a product, you can optimize it, you can test to see if it works, and then make adjustments. And once you do that over and over, you'll be continuing to build a bigger discovery or improvement in your skills. So again, take home advice for today is any of you can become a good speaker, you just have to work at it. So today I'm going to try and go over 3 different big ways of how you can improve your speaking skills. The first is we're going to talk about how you can use elements of science communication and storytelling to be able to improve how you tell your science. Next, we're going to talk about how to really improve the slides and the graphics you present. And lastly, we want to talk about how to make your research accessible to all people. So first, we're going to talk about storytelling. So I've had the extreme pleasure of attending science communication conferences and hearing many science communicators speak, as well as I've done lots of watching TED Talks about good communication skills. And you can watch them for people who are in all different kind of fields and really learn about what it takes to be a good communicator. And the number one thing that everybody agrees about is that storytelling is a really effective way to get people to remember what you want them to remember and to remember your work. So one of the most impactful things that scientists can do is share their research with other people. And this can be either sharing your research with the public or sharing your research with other scientists at a conference or something like that. And when you're sharing your research, this can have really, really productive consequences. It can cause advances in your science. It can spark new projects and collaborations. It can inspire somebody in the audience to maybe go into your field. And lastly, if you're presenting to the public, it can also lead to building trust in science, which is so necessary at this time. What's really important to remember, though, is that you could have the most exciting research in the entire world, but unless you share it with somebody, there won't be any impact of it. And how you share that research will make a huge difference in the amount of impact it has. So we really need to have really effective communication skills to be able to have these really productive science conversations. And the best way I want to teach you today for how you can improve how you can communicate your research in oral presentations is by shifting your mindset. So what I want you to do is stop thinking about it like giving a research talk and switch to thinking about it like you're telling a story about your research. And the reason why we want to do this is because we know that people will always forget facts, but they do remember stories. And storytelling is a foundational part of every culture, and that's shared through generations. So we want to be part of that process, and we want people to remember our science, so we'll tell it to them in a story. So one of the first things about telling a great story is knowing and adjusting to your audience. So this may seem super obvious. You're not going to read a book like 50 Shades of Grey to a young child, and you're not going to read The Cat in a Hat to an adult. But when we're talking about giving presentations and knowing our audience, this can be different. And this can be more complicated. So the three main types of audiences that we often speak to are the public, scientists outside of our immediate field, and scientists in our field. So let's start with scientists in your field. And this would be like if you were talking to people in your lab, or if you were going to a really specific conference where everybody else was working on similar things as you. So when you're talking to this kind of audience, you don't really have to give a lot of background information. They know your organism, they know your system or your methods that you usually use. So you can jump right in. And you're really able to highlight a lot of data and a lot of your discoveries, even if they're small. And so I find that most scientists are pretty good at doing this. On the other end, when you're talking to the public, you have to be aware of the fact that there could be a mix of different kinds of levels of scientific literacy. So you really have to take a step back and give lots and lots of background information and really explain things very well. And of course, you're going to focus on the big picture instead of focusing on small details or individual experiments, because they're really going to be excited by the big picture of your work. Now, when most of the research talks we give are actually to the group in the middle, which is the scientists that are outside of your field. And this can be like if you're giving a departmental seminar, because our departments are quite broad, or if you're giving a seminar at UHN, or if you're going to a really broad conference. And so this is where I find that a lot of people have challenges, because they treat these talks as if they were talking to people in their field. But really what you need to do is you actually still need to give a lot of background, because even people that know a lot about science probably won't know very much about your field or your organism that you're working in. So you really have to give a lot of explanations, and you really want to focus on the biggest discoveries or the best experiments instead of getting into a lot of detail about a lot of different experiments. And no matter who you're talking to, the second thing I want you to remember is to always avoid jargon and acronyms. They're things that we often think other people will know, but it's best not to assume these things. We want people to be engaged, and the best way to do that is to use simple language. Okay, so when you're deciding on what you want to talk about, the first thing we want to do is identify one clear message. What is the one thing that you want people to remember after your presentation? And really, this is because people aren't going to remember a million different things, but if you give them one thing to focus on, they're more likely to remember that. And then what you want to do is you want to design your whole research talk about proving that point, or making sure it's very clear to the audience about that point. So you're going to tell a very clear story so that they'll remember your main message, and you won't bombard them with lots of facts and data. And of course, there are instances like if you were defending your thesis where you'll have more than one project that you want to present, and that's totally okay. You just separate them into 2 chapters or vignettes so that each one will be an independent story that you'll tell together. Okay, so now that you have your main message that you want to get into your audience, you need to think about the story arc and how you want to tell that story. And the most common way that scientists tell their stories is by using the same structure as they would in a research paper. So here we would start with the introduction, the hypothesis, tell them what you think or what your goal is in your research. You're going to share your experiments and what you're doing and your results. In the discussion, you're going to explain those results and what you found. And then in the conclusion, you're going to end and tell them why they should care and how important it is. So we break this down into simpler. The order in which we're telling people things is we're going to tell them what you're doing, and then tell them how you're doing it with your experiments, and then you're going to end with why. Now, the interesting thing about this is actually the audience is most likely to be excited by the why. And this is a theory called the Golden Circle, which is from Simon Sinek. And it's a famous TED Talk that he has about his research on the Golden Circle. So what Simon's research showed is that most of the successful companies and leaders inspire other people by focusing on the why instead of focusing on the what. And so this is because his research showed that more people are inspired when they hear about the big ideas of why people are doing things. So if you tell people about why your research could have an impact on cancer or rehabilitation, they're more likely to get excited than if you start telling them what your research is about in terms of individual experiments or anything like that. And so we want to take this model of successful companies and leaders and really focus on the why. And if you think about it, we really want to rethink the way that you present your science, because why are we waiting to tell the audience the most exciting part of our research last? And especially in these times right now where there's so many distractions, will they still be listening when you get to the end and tell them the most exciting part? So instead, I would love to change the story arc and actually suggest that you start your presentations with a bang. And so what you want to do is, as soon as you log in, as soon as you start your presentation, you want to capture the audience attention from the very, very start. And we all know this, and we've all been there. You log into a seminar, even if you were going in person, if it's an in-person conference, you show up and you're not really sure yet. And all of a sudden, there's all of these competing things that are trying to get your interest. So there's people in the audience that are maybe checking their email. They have a project and new data that just came out, and they start analyzing it. Maybe they're thinking about dinner or working on their presentation that they're going to present next. Of course, we're always competing against TikTok and the massive amounts of videos there. People might be texting. And most importantly, you need to compete with the person who may be considering walking out of the room or logging off. So we really need to capture their attention so all of those people in the audience don't get distracted and don't stop listening to you. So how do we do that? So the best way we can grab their attention is by telling them the most exciting thing to start. So we want to share with them the why. Why are you excited about your research? What is the impact of your research or your research question? And I know this may seem weird, but you can tell them the most exciting finding of your project. And you can really do this by saying, let's say your project is about cancer and finding new drugs. You can start by saying, well, I'm going to tell you today about how I found a new compound that's in the clinical trials and could cure 3,000 people of cancer. That's exciting and makes people want to listen. And then you tell them, well, now I'm going to tell you how. So you're compelling them to listen to the rest of your talk to find out more. Okay, so we've captured their attention. We've made that splashy start. Now what do we do? So now you want to take that original message and you want to fill in the rest. You want to continue to tell your story by telling them about the rest of the plot, which is your data. And here, what you're really going to do is provide all of the compelling evidence, all of the research that you've done to support that finding that you told them about. And here we want to, just like a story has to progress logically, you want to share data in a very logical order. And this is important because many trainees get stuck with the idea of sharing their experiments in the order that they did them in. And this can be really difficult and really hard to really make into a story, because often we don't do experiments in the right order and we just find things out and we have to move them around. So the best thing I can think of to do for storytelling here is put together all of your data, lay it all out, and then move it around and break from the chronological order and put it into the order where you would be telling the best story, where each data point would give you the information for you to understand the next big data point. And lastly, when you're presenting your data on your slides in your presentation, you really want to guide people through it, just like you would guide them through a journey. And I'm going to show you right now, and we'll do it together, of how this could happen and how you could do that. So here I have a slide where I'm showing you a Western blot that I had in my thesis. I'm going to share with you how you can guide people through a very complicated piece of data like this. And you'll see right away your eyes are going to all the different pieces and you don't really know where to focus. And we're going to help everybody to focus on the right parts that we want. So first, when you're sharing complicated data, you can break it down into smaller parts, and you can do this using white boxes or animation. And you really want to guide the audience and tell them where they want to look and what you want them to be saying. Okay, so to start, I would break this down into just my controls. And so the first thing I would do is I would tell the audience about the protein levels that I'm measuring. And of course, they would be listening to the beginning of my talk where I would tell them why all of these proteins are important. I won't share that with you right now, though. But next, I would walk through the experimental conditions and what each of them do. So I'd explain why we're treating with hydrogen peroxide and what you should see as a result of that, and same with the doxycycline. Next, I would explain what we see with the controls. And this is really important. Lots of people don't pay attention to their controls or don't explain them in a research talk. It's really integral. So I would tell the audience to first look at the wild type. And we would see that with our treatment conditions, we're seeing no effect on the protein levels of any of the proteins. And you can use your cursor or your pointer to really guide them to where you want to look at every point in time. And then I would do that for the second set of controls. And you can even put a bullet point at the bottom to really summarize what the controls show. Next, we're going to go to the rest of the data. And this is really the important part that I really want to make an impact with. So to draw their attention, I'm going to put boxes. I'm going to tell them, now focus on this section. When we look at this strain and we treat with these conditions, this is what you see. And I'll say, hey, can you see here that we see lower levels of this protein? And I'll wait to give you a second to see if you agree with the conclusion that I came up with. And then I'll move on to the next panel and do the exact same thing. And lastly, I'll end with a bullet point that shows what the conclusions are. So what's really important here when you have complicated data, and it doesn't matter what kind of data it is, this is just an example with a Western blot, the same occurs for any piece of data, is to make sure that you go through it carefully and you guide the audience through it. Because if you go through it too quickly or they get lost, then A, they might stop listening to you, or B, they might not agree with your conclusions and they might not trust you anymore. And then again, they might stop listening to you. So you really want to keep their attention by explaining thoroughly and guiding them through the process. Okay, so next, again, we have their attention and we don't want to lose it. So we really want to make sure that we're presenting the narrative in a great and effective way. And so we want to make sure that we've provided all the background information that they needed to understand the data. So again, they're not confused. When it comes to showing our data, one of the things that's really hard to do, but is really effective, is to show less data, because less is more. So we really want to present only data or facts that are required to support your main message or conclusion, and that'll give you more time to explain those pieces of data more effectively. And lastly, we want to eliminate any noise that would distract the audience away from the main points that you're trying to make. So you want to take away any extra details, but also any things like missing labels, spelling mistakes, or if you're flipping your hair or saying and things like that. And any of those distractions can really cause you to lose the audience, and then it's hard to get them back. And again, I'm going to reinforce one more time because it's so important to me to make sure you avoid all jargon and acronyms. There's nothing that's more distracting to an audience than if somebody says a term that they think that you should understand and you have no idea what they're talking about, or if they put up an acronym and then 2 slides later you forget what it is and all of a sudden you don't remember and you're lost and you can't get back into the groove. So you've given a smashing entrance, you've guided them through a story, but now you have to end it with a satisfying summary. And so before the curtain closes and before you end, you want to leave them with a great summary that gives them all of the emotions and the feels to have them remember you. So first, you're going to reinforce what the main message is that you want them to remember. You're going to recall all the important facts that lead you to making that main message or that main conclusion. And lastly, if you want to really end it with a bang and make it really impactful, you can talk about the potential impact that continued work in this field could have. And another way to invoke that emotion to really get that effective storytelling is by using visuals. And having a really great model slide at the end can be really great for visual learners, but also just to summarize everything that you said in your talk. We'll be talking in the next section about how to make visuals. So a couple last things before we move on. The number one mistake that I see a lot of people make is that they wait till the last second to put together their presentations and then think it's going to be amazing. And I know we've all been there, stayed up until 3 a.m. working on a presentation or finishing it right before. And that can be fine sometimes, especially for great speakers, but you're giving her the best chance of having a fantastic presentation if you finish it ahead of time and you practice, practice, practice. So I would highly recommend you practice with your lab, and they're the ones that can tell you if your conclusions make sense and if there's any ways you can optimize the way you're presenting your data. You can practice with other scientists and find out whether the storytelling is working. Does the flow make sense? Is there enough information to understand the conclusions? Is there too much jargon? And lastly, you can speak and practice with your family and friends. And I know I did this a lot in grad school. I didn't have family who was aware about science or know anything about science, but they still helped me by allowing me a chance to practice more. And they would tell me things about whether I was speaking at a good pace, because lots of people speak really fast when they're nervous. I know I definitely do that. And whether they project yourself with confidence. And those are things that you can get feedback and work on. Lastly, and most importantly, is if you aren't excited about your research and your presentation, why would the audience be? One of the number one mistakes that people make is just not being excited about the research or not sharing their excitement with others. And one of the ways that you can do this is by memorizing your presentation and not using notes. And I know this sounds really difficult, but it's really important to be able to give your presentation in a really conversational way. And it's hard to do that if you're relying on your notes. And I know lots of people like to have their presenter notes there as a backup, but I often find if you have those as a backup, you'll often use them. So try to not use notes at all and just try to practice enough that you're comfortable with it. Always know that the best speakers are often people who are authentic and who are passionate. So try to really be yourself and be confident. Science is a diverse field and we have a diverse community. There's no one right way to present and there's no one right way to share your science. So find a style that works for you and just go with it and be confident. And the more that you do this, the more that you can actually have fun with it, and it'll be easy for the audience to have fun with you. Okay, so now that we know how to tell a story, we're going to move on to trying to make the most aesthetically pleasing and effective slides and graphics. Okay, so the first characteristic of slides, I like to make really, really simple slides when I make presentations. So I like to pick clear white backgrounds with a simple border at the top. And this just makes it so that there's no distractions. You also want to use your space wisely. So you want to make sure that your data is as big as you can make it so that you can really see all of the details. But you also want to make sure that there's a balance where there's white space. So again, so there's not too much on the screen to distract people. You also want to make sure that you're being internally consistent. So you can see in my presentation, I'm using the same color palette throughout my whole presentation. I'm using the same kind of font and the same font sizes. And this really helps to tell a cohesive story and make your materials very cohesive. And you'll know I'm breaking my rule because when I switch and show you some data slides, they will be a different background. But again, that's just because I like my scientific slides to be all white. Now, the perfect thing you can do about a slide is make sure that it has absolutely all of the necessary information that somebody needs to know to get to the conclusion you want them to. And this is important because, again, they might get distracted at some point, get a text or look away, and you want them to be able to return to the slide and have all of the information they need, even if they stop listening to you for a second. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So the first thing we'll do is, like I said, have a clear white slide. And at the top, at the banner, you're going to have the main point of your slide. And again, this is so that when if somebody looks away, they can learn right away. They can look at the top, see your title, and know what you're trying to say on this slide. Next, you're going to have your data, and it's going to be a prominent part on the slide. You can include 1 or 2 small bullets about your experiment, your results, or your conclusions. In the corner on the side, I like to explain any important experimental conditions and acronyms. And then on the other side, of course, you can include any relevant references. And you'll see throughout my presentation that I always put references on any images or data that I've used. So this is a simple structure. I'm going to show you how it would look with real data. So again, this is a piece of data that I presented in my defense. This is a piece of data from my thesis. And so at the top, I have the main conclusion that I want people to take from this. They'll know that HSF1 overexpression leads to overexpression in UME6 and BRG1. And these are the transcription factors that I worked on. You'll see here we have one data point, and I'll go through and explain what this data shows. I'm also going to use animations to now draw your attention to the other side of the screen where I have another piece of data which shows a similar thing. So I put two pieces of data, but they're very similar, so it makes sense to put them on the same slide. And then I put an extra piece of data at the bottom that the reader can see. I have the experimental conditions, I have the number of replicates, and I have the reference. So I think this is a very simple way that you can see how the data can be shown in a very striking but effective way. So now that we know how to set up our slides, I want to talk about how we can make better graphs and images to use in your presentations. And one of my favorite tools for doing this is using data visualization softwares like R, RStudio, or Prism. And these can really help to make your data look more professional. Now, it does take some time to learn, but softwares like R and RStudio are free, and there's lots of resources available to learn them. So I'll start first by showing you this piece of data, which is a Venn diagram. And here I'm showing you the intersection between three of my different data sets. And it looks fine. You can see the data. It looks pretty good. But now I'm showing you how I was able to elevate this graph by going into RStudio and making a Euler diagram instead. Now, Euler diagrams cannot be made in PowerPoint, which is the advantage of using RStudio. And in a Euler diagram, what you're able to do is actually scale the size of the circles to the number of data points within that circle. And so it really gives you this extra visual aspect where you can see how much overlap there are between the data sets. And this was something that was very easy to put together using sample codes and resources that were online. And it just makes it look a little bit more professional and exciting. Now we can elevate other kinds of graphs like bar graphs. And so this is a basic Excel graph, and many of us have made these before. And I definitely, when I first started graduate school, always use these Excel graphs, and you can see them in my first paper. I definitely published with one of these colorful bar graphs, and it's totally fine. But I want to show you how you can make it even better using software like Prism. And lots of the tips I'm going to tell you about Prism and why it's great, you can also do on Excel if you want to. You just need to work with it a bit. So the reason why this bar graph is better or more professional than the Excel graph is we're making sure that we have the error bars displayed and the statistical significance. And Prism is really great because it allows you to do that statistical significance calculations within the software. This figure is also great because it has a clear legend and proper coloring. All of the information you needed to understand the data is there. We have really clear, legible axes labels, which is so important. So many people put up data and you actually can't read any of the words on it. And if people can't read the words, they're not getting your data. So you really want to make sure that everything is legible. And lastly, I've also used a break in the axis to help so that you can tell the differences between the smaller values as well as the large impact of the larger value. So this is just one way you can elevate your data using Prism, but Prism has lots of different ways that you can make different kinds of graph, and I really highly recommend exploring it. Now, Prism is a software that you have to pay for, but you can get free trials, as well as you can talk to other people in your lab or your department and see if other people have a subscription or would be willing to share a subscription. I think it's definitely worth it for the professional factor and that statistical help that it gives you. Now, besides bar graphs and Venn diagrams, there are lots of different kinds of effective graphs that you can make and you can really elevate. And my favorite thing about using R and RStudio is that there's lots of free resources and sample codes that you can just adapt to really make different kinds of graphs and heat maps. And so I really urge you, if you haven't tried R yet, to dip your toe into the water and try it, because it can really help your images both for your presentations as well as your publications. So we've talked about your data and how to display your data, but we can also talk about how to use graphics. And this is really important because compelling graphics and images can be more effective than using tables or written or verbal explanations. So if you can take something and make it to a graphic, you can have way more impact. And the perfect example of this is if I share with you this adorable picture of a puppy. Now it's going to capture your attention and evoke more emotion than if I just describe the puppy. And what's really great about this is really that attention and emotion evoking is what makes the audience more likely to remember your presentation. So what I'd love for you to do is minimize the amount of words that you have on your slides, minimize the amount of tables, and maximize the effective pictures or graphics that you use. And we'll talk now about how you can make those graphics. So first, I'm going to give you an introduction of research presentation and how you can replace some of the words for an image. So this is an introduction slide that I would give in my presentation for my thesis, where I'm explaining all the important details about Candida albicans, the organism that I worked on, and how it is deadly, and it really causes disease and fatalities in immunocompromised individuals. But if I were to switch it around and adjust it, so now I have this really striking image from the CDC, and of course I've included the reference for that image on the bottom, but you have this striking image that really expresses the emotion of how dangerous these infections can be and how many deaths they cause. And again, I do still have the bullet points at the bottom, but I've shortened them so they're the only most impactful points. And now you're going to be listening to what I'm saying about this slide instead of just reading all the words off of it. So you can make these visuals and graphics if they don't already exist. And there's lots of free resources that you can use to make them. The first one is the Noun Project, and they have lots of different icons that you can use. There's over 3 million of them, and they're free to use. And here's just some examples of some of the scientific icons that they have. Another one you can use is Flat Icon. They have over 6 million icons. These ones are great because they have additional options for pictures in color. And you'll see throughout my presentation, I use a lot of the flat icon pictures. And I wanted to show here too, they also have a diversity of images. So even for fields like rehabilitation or people using virtual reality in their interventions, you might be able to find images that work for your presentation. One of my favorite ways to make graphics, though, is using Biorender, a fantastic software that came out of Toronto and was developed in Toronto. And it is really easy to make professional looking with Biorender. And this is because it is made for the life sciences. So it has over 4,000 life sciences images. And these images can be really detailed and really specific. So you have lots of things about stem cells and neurons. You can change the colors. They have all different orientations. And you can really start off with lots of great pictures to make your diagrams from. And what's great about Biorender is it's free for educational purposes, but they also have academic pricing available. So I'm going to now show you what you can do to elevate and to replace some of these words with images. So one of the places you can do it is when you're creating visuals for your experimental plan. So often explaining your experimental plan is important because you want to explain it before you go into the data. So you want to show all the steps first. And so if you were doing that with just words, you could do it like this, and it looks okay, but like it's boring and it's not a good effective use of space. So one other option you have is to use PowerPoint Smart Art and make a flow chart. And this is definitely much prettier, and you could include the data at the bottom. So it could be, a little bit more effective. But if you were to instead make a diagram to visualize your pipeline, and this was made using Biorender, you get that immediate impact of how beautiful this is. And now everybody can picture what's happening at every step. And it'll really help you to tell that story about that experimental pipeline. Now, this is actually a template on Biorender, and they have lots of templates that you can just optimize and change the details for to use it for your own experimental pipeline. So something like this may look complicated to make, but it's actually quite easy. Another place that you can use graphics for is your summary slide, like we mentioned before. And one of the best things you can do is make a model diagram. And I always like to suggest people do this, even if they're early in their project and they don't feel like they have enough to make a model. You can always make a model with whatever pieces you have. And it's okay to put in question marks of things you don't know. And really creating a picture of it really helps to tell the story better. And these are both diagrams or summary models that were made with Biorender using their platform and the different templates and icons that they have. So really use this as a way to make a picture to reinforce your take-home message, and it can be used in your research talks as well as in your publications. So the final touches that have a big impact is you really want to make sure, again, that there's no noise in this presentation. You want to make sure that you go through them with a fine-tooth comb and everything is perfect. So you want to take out any errors in spelling, grammar, or spacing. Make sure that everything is perfectly aligned, so it has a clean, fresh look. You want to make sure you have all of the data labels you need and you're not missing any important information. And of course, if you have to use acronyms, which sometimes we need to do in diagrams because of the lack of space, make sure that they're all described. And my favorite tool for making sure that the alignment on all of my images is perfect is using alignment on PowerPoints. And I don't know, it was like halfway through grad school when I found out that you could do this, and it just made everything so much easier and cleaner. So if you don't know about this yet, please check it out. And if you do, I'm sure you knew way before me, but I love it so much, so I had to mention it. So just make sure any mistakes you have can really distract or confuse the audience. So just make sure that you're being careful and you make sure your slides are perfect. The last thing to do to make sure that your presentation is ready to go is to test with your slides with the organizer ahead of time. And this can really make sure that all of your images look exactly as they should, especially if you're in person and you have to move your slides to another computer and it's a Mac versus a PC, they might not display properly. You want to make sure you know how to use the laser pointer and you know how to advance properly, and make sure that you're speaking at a good volume and a good pace. And those are all things you can do ahead of time. And all of these things can really help you, because if you're nervous, being prepared like this can really help you avoid mishap. Okay, so lastly, now you know how to tell a story, you have beautiful slides and you're ready to go. I'm going to tell you the last couple of tools you can do to really change small things about your presentation to make sure you're engaging your whole audience and that nobody is missed out or feeling excluded. So the first thing is, we know that there's a huge population in the world that is unable to see color or to distinguish between color. And it's important to keep these people in mind when you're preparing your research presentations and also when you're preparing your papers, because you never know if your viewers or your readers will be colorblind. So I want to show you the impact that this can have. So on the slide here, you have a color wheel and how it would be seen by a person who is not colorblind. Next, we show 3 different color wheels of the same colors, but as it is seen by a person who is unable to see green, unable to see red, and unable to see blue. So you can really see how few of the colors are able to translate for these people, and how you can still tell the difference between some of those shades, but how it really changes how the data might be seen. And this is so important to keep in mind because it can change how your data is viewed and interpreted. I'm going to give you an example. So here is a heat map, and these are commonly used with the colors red to green to show varying levels of data. Now, the problem is this is what the heat maps look like for a person who can't see red and who can't see green. And immediately the thing that you can see is you no longer can determine any of those high or low points. And so the reader or person listening to you will not be able to see any of your conclusions anymore. And that's a problem. Another example is here, if you're doing bar graphs and you choose 5 different colors, a person who is colorblind might not be able to see 2 of those colors. So now you've collapsed your scale. So instead of seeing 5 different variables, the audience can only see 3. Now, there's a really easy fix for this. All you have to do is pick a color palette that is amenable to people who are colorblind. So in this case, we picked 5 different colors. And although a colorblind person can't see the same colors as you, they can still distinguish between the 5 different variables. And so our first tip, if you're trying to be accessible to people who are colorblind, and this is super important when you're thinking about fluorescence images, where you often are using GFP, which is green, and RFP, which is red. So instead of showing them on the same graph, try to separate them into different panels, and you can even use grayscale. Other tips is you can use contrasting colors of dark and light, and this really helps. And I often also do this when make sure your text and your backgrounds are really high contrast. So again, it'd be easy for people to see those. You can also use other elements like shading, lines, or shapes to distinguish between the variables instead of using color. There are lots of tools out there to help you pick accessible color palettes. One of them for R is Color Brewer, and it helps you. You can look at tons of different color choices and tons of different scales, all of which would be accessible. And lastly, once you made your figures, you can test them with a simulator like Color Oracle to see what they would look like to a colorblind person and make sure that they are interpretable. Next, for accessibility for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, you can ensure that your presentations always have subtitles. This is also useful for people whose first language isn't English. And so what you can do is check with the organizers to see if there will be automatic captioning. An event like this, we have Zoom, and our Zoom account has live captioning. So as a presenter, I don't have to worry about it because it's built into the platform. But in other cases, other Zoom accounts might not have those features, or the organizers might not turn them on. And so if you don't have access to that, you can also use the simple tools such as PowerPoints or other programs have just a simple box you have to tick. You just turn it on, and all of a sudden your presentation will have captioning, and you'll be making it much, much more accessible. Next, to increase the accessibility for people with visual impairments, one of the best things you can do, which is also part of storytelling, is when you're going through your story and your slides, verbally describe all of the data very clearly for somebody who wouldn't be able to see the data. We can also help by putting fonts that are easy to read, like Arial and Calibri, and using font sizes that are larger. So always try to use font sizes that are a minimum of 18 so that you can see, so that even people with visual impairments can see them. And lastly, if you're using any printouts or graphics, you can add alt text. This is less important for oral presentations, but if you're sending out your slides after, make sure you add those for people who are using screen readers. Another thing we can do to be accessible is to adopt gender neutral language. And it's really important when we're talking about our research to make sure that we're properly using the terms sex and gender. And so we really want to avoid gendered phrases when we're talking to the audience. So we want to avoid saying things like guys or ladies and gentlemen and replace it with words like folks. We can also avoid gendered phrases when referencing conditions. So for example, when you're talking about endometrial cancer, you can talk about it in people with vaginas, because there are non-binary or trans people who also have vaginas and would be affected by endometrial or could be affected by endometrial cancer. And we also want to be conscious of this when we're reporting patient data. Some other general accessibility tips. The first one is really hard. I probably made this mistake during my presentation, but I try not to, is to avoid using phrases such as obviously or as you all know, and this can just make people feel really bad if you tell them something is obvious, but then they don't know it. And it's just something that it'd be great to avoid. Avoid using terms like normal to mean healthy. Use the word healthy or use other terms that are more accurate of what you're describing so that we don't other anyone. And when you can, try to use inclusive images that display the full diversity of your patient population or the populations that you're working with. And I love using Canva for this because they have really accessible and inclusive images. Lastly, this is something that I'm just learning about, and everybody should learn about themselves. These are just some tips I found, but I'm sure there's lots more out there. So it'd be great if you could also learn about accessibility issues And of course, we know that with these things, we often make mistakes, and it's important just to adjust your practices if you're corrected or if you are presented with new information. So just be open to the process and really try to just improve the way you present and what you're doing so we can engage all people. Okay, so to wrap up, in summary, one of the things I want you to take home from this presentation is anyone can become a good communicator if they're willing to put in the work. So please practice telling your story about your research, practice improving the way you present your data, improve your slides slowly over time, improve your graphs slowly over time, and just keep working to make them better. And small changes that you can make can really lead to big impacts in your presentation style and how you engage your audience. So with that, I am done. So I welcome any questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Slido. If you have to hop out, that's totally fine. We highly appreciate if you could fill out our short feedback form so that we can learn about what you liked about this presentation and what more you want to see from us. And thank you all for joining us. Okay, so now we will take some questions. Okay, so the first question, people memorizing presentation sounds monotonous and tend to look in a cloud where they tend to read their notes. What are techniques that you suggest? I think that's a great point, and lots of people tell you not to actually memorize your slides and your presentations. I like memorizing them as a start. So the first thing I do is memorize my presentations so that I know them off by heart. But then the next step after that is to keep practicing them and to work on making them conversational. To me, I can't make it conversational if I don't remember the data first, because then I'm going to say, and I'm going to get stuck. So I need to memorize it first. But lots of other people are good at being conversational. But I would agree with you, there's nothing worse than having somebody just act really monotonous and not being paid attention. You really want to be an engaging speaker. The next question, should we highlight take-home messages at the start or at the end of the presentation? That's a great question. And what I would say is you want to do both. So what you want to do is reinforce the message just like I did. So I told you at the very start what the one thing I wanted you to take home was, but I also told you at the end. And that way you really reinforce that point so they're more likely to remember it. Another question, should pipelines be designed in a clockwise manner or is anti-clockwise jarring for the audience? I agree. Always go in a clockwise manner. That's normally how our brains work, I believe, and it just becomes more intuitive. You also have the capability of guiding them through where you want them to look, either by animating one at a time or using your pointer. So you always have that as a guide, but I think going clockwise is more intuitive for people. Great. So that looks like all of the questions on Slido. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and see if there are any other questions in the chat. Also, for anybody who has other tips, things that they find are effective in communication or other accessibility tips, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will share them with all of the attendees after.